as gay men, I think what we're taught to fear and even loathe is feminine
Yeah.
expression. This process of coming out and understanding yourself and working through not liking feminine parts of yourself. I think for a lot of gay men who've already come out and have been living in the community for a long time, if they are part of the gym culture and they have those sculpted bodies, I think they also fear what it might mean to lose muscle mass or to gain weight. Which group will they be part of? I'll lose my social status and I'll be closer to this category of people. And so we haven't really broken the cycle. It's
No.
just changed shape. Our losing privilege, feeling undesirable, especially when it comes to body image and your presentation of masculinity. These things are like your ticket. They're your currency for sex, connection, acceptance, all of that.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Unapologetic podcast. My name is Pierre. I'm your host and the founder of the gay brand Unapologetic. And today I am talking to Rahim Thawer. He's the author of a new book called The Mental Health Guide for Cis and Trans Queer Guys. So, welcome, Rahim.
Thank you, Pierre, for having me.
Before we talk about your book, I would love for you to introduce yourself because you have an amazing bio, and I think it would sound much better if you about it.
I am born and raised in Canada, in Toronto specifically. My parents are from East Africa, Tanzania, and grandparents from India. So I understand myself as Indo-African, Canadian, raised Muslim, and very queer. I am a social worker and psychotherapist. A lot of my work as a therapist has been in LGBTQ communities. Particularly, there's been a focus on people living with affected by HIV, queer guys struggling with substance use or wanting to explore substance use and therapy, and also focus on navigating casual sex and relationships, the challenges around that. My therapy approach is a mix of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is about the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, Gestalt therapy, which is about how you feel in your body and how you experience things, and psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which is about connecting the past to the present, thinking about the impact of early childhood, and also considering how the unconscious plays a role in protecting us and sometimes working against us in what we call defense mechanisms. All three of those modalities show up in my work and in this book that I've created. I'm really passionate about mental health, but also the subcultural context in which we live as queer guys. I think we live in a fascinating subculture that is amazing, liberating, full of opportunities for expression and living an authentic life, but also comes with its own slew of challenges,
Yeah.
internal hierarchies, forms of exclusion, and different set of values, etc.
I really love what you said about the hierarchy because when I came out, actually before even I came out, I grew up around people who were very ashamed of being black. And
Mm,
I grew up in the Caribbean and there still is a lot of colorism,
mm,
so the whiter you are, the better. And what you said about hierarchy was exactly what I realized or I recognized when I came out. I started spending time in the community and around other gay men.
mm.
And that sort of hierarchy I'm talking about is instead of skin color is passing for masculine or passing for straight. Is it what you mean?
Yeah, I think when I think about any subpopulation or subcommunity, I think about their own internal hierarchy. So, yes, colorism, which I think also plays out in the gay community, but there's the additional layer of the range of masculinities and who's closer to not the norm, but closer to what's seen as powerful,
Ooh, good way
right?
to
It's
put it.
proximity to power. And I think that proximity to power shows up in your mannerisms, your gender expression, your your physique, your body.
Social background as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think economic class
Yeah.
is a big thing.
In the UK
Um,
especially, they're crazy about class.
oh, say more.
I really see how that actually benefits me
Mm,
because even though I'm a black gay foreigner, because I'm coming from a middle class background
yes.
and colorism, I'm here,
Mm.
I'm seen as not very dark.
Ah,
So
yes.
I'm really treated as a French man that happens to be black rather than a black man.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Is this your experience as well?
I think people would hear my accent or other signifiers of class or economic background, and they see me more as legitimately Canadian. Like you're more Canadian than somebody who has an accent or is a more recent newcomer. And so there's a bit of a hierarchy there. I've had people say anti-immigrant things in front of me as though I'm part of their group, not another group, and it's an uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah, yeah. So how did you react to that? Oh, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you manage, did you call them out or what happened?
I have, yes, to say we're all immigrants here on stolen land. It's taken a long time to find the language for it. It's hard to figure out when you're in a moment what you can say and can't say. And I recognize that the privilege around that shows up in places where there's nothing to even call out necessarily. Like when I'm traveling, I know that other people in my family are more likely to get stopped at a border crossing, and I tend to be okay. And I think there's something really interesting also about being like a femme gay man, which in many contexts marginalizes me. But when it comes to these authorities, I think they see my Muslimness less and they see my gayness more. And they see that as not threatening, and they see me as more one of theirs, and I'm fine. Uh, it's a really complex dynamic.
Yeah,
It makes me think about these exact things we're talking about, which is about identity and how we understand ourselves, but also how other people understand us, right? To me, that has a lot to do with how we experience shame,
yeah,
you know, because shame is often about our internalization of how the world sees us. So as gay men, people might see us as less than, or they see us as a threat. They see us as we bring out difficult feelings in them, like disgust or like that. And they can get very violent. And that impacts how we see ourselves and how we carry ourselves in social situations. And when we're talking about race within specific communities, so you were talking about colorism, and I'm talking about being Canadian born versus somebody who's a more recent immigrant to Canada. Each set of people has its own internalized shame around who they want to be associated with or
yeah,
what they want to be have some distance from, right? So in present day, yes, I would say you really shouldn't see me as different from those other immigrants. But there was an earlier time in my life where I would have appreciated being seen
yeah.
differently, right? Because it's proximity to power, essentially.
Is it a sense of safety?
Yes.
Because I
I
think
think
for
it,
me, it was.
yeah, absolutely. A sense of safety in the system of white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. That system is very interesting because my safety depends on distancing myself from somebody else and aligning with
Somebody else.
an existing power.
Right that I had come out
Hmm.
because there were no role models for black gay men I knew of. The only black person at the time was what we would call today a non-binary individual.
Ah.
So I thought, no, that's not me. I was really conscious of, I was really effeminate, like, not effeminate, but really flamboyant because I
Hmm.
thought that that's what gay men were.
Yes.
Or I was trying to pass for straight. For example, if a young woman was showing interest in me, I would feel flattered. Now, So obviously now, luckily I'm past that, but that's definitely a part of my evolution as a gay man.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting example because on the one hand, it's very important to see people who represent you, to see yourself reflected in others. That's an important psychological and developmental need and desire and longing, right? That's why so many of us gravitate toward therapy and support groups and community building and congregating at the bar or wherever, because we want to be around people who understand us, look like us, see the world like us. However, as gay men, I think what we're taught to fear and even loathe is feminine
Yeah.
expression. And so when you talk about seeing somebody who's more femme than you, yes, they don't exactly represent you, but I would suggest, or I would say that there's a chance that there was a strong reaction that was about a kind of internalized homophobia or a fear of it being associated with femininity,
Yeah.
because it brings lots of stigma. Proximity to that person takes away some of your power in the world.
Yeah. Not
And that
just that.
speaks to shame.
Yeah. Not just that, but these are not your words, but that's how I hear them. That might actually limit me. That might actually close some doors for me if I'm assimilated to this group or that group or whatever.
This process of coming out and understanding yourself and working through not liking feminine parts of yourself, I think for a lot of gay men who've already come out and have been living in the community for a long time, if they're part of the gym culture and they have those sculpted bodies, I think they also fear what it might mean to lose muscle mass or to gain weight. Which group will they be part of? It's a similar kind of fear. I'll lose my social status and I'll be closer to this category of people. And so we haven't really broken the cycle. It's
No.
just changed shape.
Do you think we're aware even of the cycle?
I think we're aware of it. Yeah, look, I think people are very smart. I think they're aware of it, but it's hard to confront our losing privilege, feeling undesirable, especially when it comes to body image and your presentation of masculinity. These things are like your ticket, they're your currency for sex, connection, acceptance, all of that. I would even argue that gay men's culture that focuses a lot on physique and sculpted bodies and muscularity, I think in many ways that is a ticket or it is like a permission slip to then be more feminine. I have these signifiers of masculinity. It allows me to feel more comfortable with feminine expression. So I think we're working through that stuff our whole lives.
To go back to your book, my understanding is that it's a self-help guide, isn't it?
Yes, it's a self-help guide. The way it's written is that it speaks directly to the reader. And I know that not everybody can be in therapy, or when people get to therapy, they can afford a certain number of sessions. And so my hope is that this will reach a lot of gay men who can do some of the work on their own and really think about what are the things in the gay subculture that affect their mental health. Is it body image? Is it substances? Is it coming out? Is it their relationship to their families of origin? Is it experience with faith communities? Is it aging, etc.?
Or all of the
Um,
above?
oh, yes, everything. So you'll be getting a copy then, Pierre.
You talk about something that I think we've brushed already a little bit about the milestone heteronormativity, but
Mm.
the next chapter is called Disenfranchised Grief. Can you talk about that?
Grief is usually when we talk about it, it's our emotional experience as a response to loss. And when we say loss, usually we're talking about death. Among gay men who lived through the height of the AIDS epidemic, the grief they experienced was related to death. And what made it disenfranchised is that the reason people died, the way they contracted the virus, and the kinds of bonds we have in our community are not recognized by a dominant society. So that's what makes the group and what makes the grief disenfranchised. So that's one of the things I address in that chapter. But there's so many other kinds of disenfranchised grief related to non-death losses, right? I think people experience loss around their families of origin sometimes. Other times people feel like they have to choose between their sexuality and gender versus a faith community or cultural identity, right? Or their families. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. I think there's also grief around masculinity, right? Just recognizing what we might never be and what we might never be to people in the world. Like a lot of us are not going to be in long-term relationships necessarily and have children. And that comes with a kind of grief for a lot of us who feel like we've let down our families, or we feel like our families can't see us for the kinds of achievements or the milestones we have reached, right? So I think there's grief all around us all of the time. When we hear about trans women of color who die at disproportional rates, when we hear about homophobia on a large scale, we're constantly experiencing disenfranchised grief because the culture around us just continues to live. It doesn't stop to say, oh my gosh, that's such a heavy loss. I think for a lot of us, even in our relationships, we might choose not to get married. We might be polyamorous. We might be non-monogamous. Any relationship that's unconventional, that endures a breakup, has significant loss attached to it that other people are just going to not necessarily recognize. And so I think we need to really pause and think about how we're processing grief and how we carry it around with us, because nobody stops to give us space to talk about it.
Especially, that's my experience of being a minority, is power dynamic. As minorities, then we are sort of dependent on other people's support and reaction.
And we're fighting so often for acknowledgement that we're valid, we're important, and not getting it is another kind of grief. I think we see it with ongoing conflict in the world, where there could be hundreds and thousands of brown and black people who die. The bigger tragedy is a much smaller number of white people who die. And any death is bad, but that there's a disenfranchised grief there about
how it's
not
dealt
just the
with.
lives lost.
Have you always lived in the West, as in Canada?
Yeah, most of my life has been in Canada. I did live for a year in Singapore when I was much younger. I was 21. And then a couple of years ago, I lived in South Africa during the height of the pandemic, when there was lockdowns and I could work remotely, and I took off and I was like, I'm going to go somewhere else. So I lived in South Africa for a little while. And I have to say, what's really lovely about being a queer person is that you can travel and find community in all kinds of places, right? Some straight friends of mine have said, you travel, you seem to know people. And I'm like, girl, I met them on Grindr, and then they introduced me to their friends, and then I went to the bar. And so there are certain ways that we've learned to adapt and cope that benefit us more. There's more sustainability and longevity there than I think straight people have developed. I think the context of and like the changing geographic locations and just observing how you're experienced is so fascinating. I know when I was in Singapore, so this is quite a while ago, 2006, 2007, in many ways I didn't have to explain being Muslim, because there's lots of people who are Malay Muslim there. And in that way, I was part of a dominant group, even though ethnically the majority was Chinese, but I was well represented in the dominant group. And that was fascinating. And then fast forward to just 2 years ago in South Africa, Muslims are not a majority by any means, but Indian folks and Muslims are well represented in the dominant culture. And so again, I was regarded in a certain way, or my experience was also reflected in the dominant culture. So both of those feel like they're very refreshing. You find your place in a different way, a different level of comfort altogether. Um, and there's more room for diversity among your people when you're not under the magnifying glass of being the immigrant. But in both contexts, Singapore and South Africa, one thing that's interesting is how I'm regarded as somebody from the West. People see me as, oh my gosh, you come from that place that we all want to be.
You're a white
And
man,
so
basically.
there's an interesting kind of envy. And then I observe my own people, or sometimes brown and black folks, like how they compete with one another for the attention of white folks.
Mm.
And that is an interesting thing to observe. It just lets me know the power of whiteness the world over. There isn't a place, there isn't a corner of this earth that white supremacy hasn't touched.
I used to be a flight attendant.
Ah.
And every time I went to Africa, obviously they knew I was black. But exactly as you said, that I was treated as a Westerner, a white man.
The dynamics shift quickly, where going from South Africa, where you feel fairly well understood, included, you're Muslim, people understand what that is and what that means. If I go just a little bit over the way to Tanzania, where my parents are from, South Asian people are automatically assumed to be part of a higher economic class and background. And the treatment is very different. And very quickly, there's a shift where I witness in my own community of South Asian people and South Asian Muslims, like a lot of anti-Black racism. And my people will talk about the way they were kicked out of East Africa and the challenges they experienced politically. And while that's true, there's not also like a balanced acknowledgement of the privilege of just seeing yourself as part of a business class that brings and drives the economy. You go from there, where you're just automatically assumed to be not just middle, but upper class, take a flight just to North Africa or the Middle East, where people will look at me and say they assume I'm from India and they can't imagine that there's an Indian Muslim. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you guys colonize us, so we're Muslim too now. There's just no space in this Arab imagination to think, oh, this guy's also Muslim. And I think just like going to Dubai, for example, or I visited Oman, where Arabs are all the elite and South Asian people are absolutely like the laborers. They're working around the clock in the hot sun with no labor rights. They're absolutely exploited. And the way you're perceived, there's like a majority minority relation everywhere, right? And it really influences how you understand yourself. And I would say these are the specific contextual things we need to think about when we think about mental health, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's how you're seen, and how you're seen influences how you understand yourself. Do you have power? Do you not? Can you advocate for yourself? Can you not? Do you have to surrender, or can you climb? Do you have access to mobility in the world? I think in each of our contexts, we need to take a hard look at what are the negative messages I've internalized about myself, and what have I learned to not just dislike, but be ashamed of, experience disgust around.
Yeah.
And we need to have a balance of a firm talk with ourselves about how this internalized dialogue maintains existing power structures in the world. And then we also need a lot of self-compassion.
Yeah.
For being victims and survivors of a world that thrives on our dislike for ourselves. That's why we buy products, we participate in the world, we continue things. It's a balance between firm talk, real talk, and self-compassion. If I think about specific examples for gay men who are racialized, who really don't like themselves or have never found somebody who looks like them attractive, I would say, I'm not going to tell you who to be attracted to, but take a pause and just look at what kind of porn do you watch? And when you go to a gay bar, who do you want to be most like? Who do you envy? Who do you want acceptance from? And who do you distance yourself from? And just think about what it would be like to shift that a little bit, right? Just consider it as opposed to thinking that I have all the answers. The way I am is I'm in control and everything is a preference. Take a step back and think about how the world has shaped you and what it would be like to participate slightly differently. I've met some folks who say, oh, I don't fuck white people. And so that could be your strategy for a little while. See what it's like to live in the world in a different way where you don't devalue yourself or other people like you. It can
Yeah.
look like many things.
For many years, I used to be quite insecure around all the black men.
Ah, yes.
And I always said, oh my God, am I black enough? Am I different?
Mm.
And I actually realized not long ago, English culture, British culture and French culture, very different. It took me a while to understand really that, of course, it's not that I'm not black enough. It's just that I'm black differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is one of the key features of colonization in a way,
Yeah.
where many of us just feel disconnected from ancestral history and culture. And it's very legitimate to want to understand it, to reclaim it, have it be part of our identities. But that's more accessible to some versus others. And yes, we need to think about like heterogeneity in our own like categorical communities. In my context, I think a lot about what it means to be a queer Muslim, for example. If I'm too rigid in that thinking, a lot of people get excluded. But when I think about what do I need when it comes to building community, I think it's anybody who has a similar experience of being raised Muslim or even understanding what it's like being part of a Muslim majority country or a Muslim community. I don't actually need to feel seen and understood. I don't need to police and surveil someone else to say, what do you believe and how do you pray and do you believe in God? And I don't care. That's not so important. And so I think we, in our own search for connection to something that is authentic, it's important not to exclude other people along the way,
Yeah.
right?
I keep thinking about discussing connections within our family of origin. That's a challenge in itself. But if it's possible at all, do you think that's a good place to start?
Yeah. Pierre, tell me more about what you mean around family of origin. And are you talking about conversations or understanding our own culture better?
Maybe both. What I was thinking was, for example, at school especially, I really feel, and I'm quite sure that is still the case, that it's easier to talk about experiences of racism than homophobia or transphobia, because I think as a whole, society is more prepared to protect from racism than homophobia or transphobia.
Ah,
That's what I meant. Am I making
yes,
sense?
it's totally making sense. I think in my experience, this is actually where disenfranchised grief comes in.
Yeah.
Because
You're on your own.
yeah, and if I'm in a Muslim majority setting, I think my grief around homophobia and being targeted, I think it's poorly understood, or I don't necessarily know that I'll be like stood up for or protected.
Yeah.
But also in queer spaces, I don't know that all queer people like care about racial justice necessarily, right? So there's a loss in both settings. There's a part of you that kind of gets suspended. I think back to 2016. Oh my gosh, several years ago now. But 2016 stands out to me very clearly in my mind because that was a year where we had quite a visible protest in Toronto from Black Lives Matter. And they were protesting police brutality. And they had stopped the Pride Parade that year to demand justice, and they wanted people in Pride to really think about the connection between police brutality and LGBTQ complicity. And so many people just couldn't understand what one had to do with the other. And I think that's a perfect example of how a lot of racialized people, and I guess particularly in that context, Black folks, maybe even Indigenous folks, don't feel seen in mainstream gay, lesbian, queer community because there's a whole other fight around basic human rights that gay people have in the West that other groups still don't.
Yeah.
And the mainstream queers don't necessarily see that. Some do, many do. There's a good number of people who do not. And for a lot of us, that leaves us vulnerable.
Yeah.
And unseen and grieving.
I don't know if that's what you mean. I understand that as there's always a part of myself that I have to leave at the door, to keep dormant.
Yes.
So maybe that's sort of psychological gymnastic where I read the room and say, okay, so who do I need to be?
Yeah. And this is, I love that term, mental gymnastics. I think it's both brilliant and resilient, but also exhausting.
Yeah, and really sad.
The skills we've developed, but it's tiring.
Yeah.
I think if we recognize that a sense of community, which we've talked about is so important to a lot of LGBTQ people, and we know in a broader sense, a sense of belonging is really important to people everywhere for their mental health. We can't think about mental health as an individual endeavor. We do need to think about it as community level. So I think we need to start there. But as a therapist, of course, I do work with people on an individual level. So concrete strategies around working through shame, for example, I would say you might think about, my first suggestion was think about how you might do things differently, right? How you might participate in the world slightly differently and observe that. I think another one is to think about specific situations that trigger your anxiety or your shame. And you know when you experience shame because it can just feel all encompassing. You feel like very exposed. You feel like you want to hide. You wish the earth would open and swallow you up. So you know that feeling. So think about and identify the moments when that feeling gets activated. And then for that particular situation, think about what are all the thoughts that come up for me? So let's see if we could do a trial with you. Is that okay, Pierre? Okay. So tell me about a situation that activates some of your shame. An event, a setting, a person.
So for example, a few weeks ago, actually, I was at a charity event and I was asked to talk, and that was unexpected. At first, I stammered a lot. I remember I felt so much shame that I really felt myself dissociated, completely leaving my body. Is that a good example?
No, that's perfect. That's a perfect example of a situation. So when you left your body, it would be hard to identify what you were thinking. But right before that happened, what were you thinking leading up to, or the moments before you had to give this talk? What was going on in your mind? So things like, people will think, or I will. Whoa, help me finish those.
Yeah. It wasn't so much about what people would think. I was more focused on, okay, so what do I want to say? And I think it wasn't about what people would think. It was more about, I think I put a lot of pressure on myself because I was in a gay bar, and I think that to be around my people, that put a lot of pressure on me.
Beautiful.
I felt a lot of pressure on me. Because
Yes.
I really believe that if it was a room full of straight people or whatever, so I think deep down there was an element of seduction or, oh, please like me, please, all this kind of thing.
Exactly. So let's go a step further. What were you afraid would happen in a community of your own people?
Rejection. That's my, I wanted to avoid rejection. Oh, God.
Okay. And what would they reject you based on in that context?
They just don't like me. It's nothing particular. They just don't like me.
When you think about the context of gay community, when people don't like you, what does that usually mean? What does it usually say about you?
I'm not good enough. I don't belong. Yeah, these are the main things.
Is it, when it's I don't belong, is it, I'm just trying to see here, is it I'm not gay enough, or I will disappoint them, or I'll be judged by my own people and I won't be able to come back?
Judged. And it's more, oh yeah, no, we don't like you. You can't sit with it.
You
That kind
can't
of
sit
thing.
with us.
Yeah,
Yes, that's very Mean Girls. Yes.
exactly. That kind of,
And
it, now I know with all the mental health work I've done, that's actually my first day at school where I
yes,
felt
okay.
really rejected and I felt like I didn't belong, all of that. That's
Okay.
the
So
thing.
you have a vivid memory of
Yeah, that
that.
was reenacted.
Yes. And when you were a younger person at school, if you weren't liked on the first day or you were judged, what would the long-term consequence of that be in school?
There was that whole hierarchy again, where I would be at the bottom of the hierarchy or maybe not even on the board.
Yes. And if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, what does that mean? Fewer opportunities, no friends,
Yeah,
loneliness.
exactly. A full year.
Okay.
Oh,
So you're entering this space where you're giving a talk, um, and what comes up for you is a memory from childhood that's very similar. And you have this embodied experience of rejection. If you make a mistake or something doesn't go well, and you're thinking the long-term consequence, right? This is my one and only chance. If I don't do well, it'll affect my long-term relationships. Your thought, your belief here is if I don't do well now, I will suffer long-term consequences, right? And what is your evidence for thinking that happened in childhood? The strategy here, now that we've identified the hot thought or the prominent thought, is to come up with an alternative. And come from a cognitive behavioral perspective, the alternative might be something like when I was younger, the stakes were much higher because people didn't know themselves as well. Another thing I might say to myself, an alternative thought might be if I mess up, I'll still have friends when I leave this space, right? Or I could make a mistake and my entire future and worth isn't going to be decided on this one talk, right? So these are the kinds of alternative thoughts we would come up with. So that's what CBT looks like. And that's what's scattered throughout the book. A way to think about a specific situation that brings up a difficult feeling, to analyze the thoughts that come up, and then identify an alternative, more helpful thought.
I feel like saying, what about white gay men? Because I really believe that we all experience shame.
I think we all experience shame, anxiety, depression, body image concerns, difficulty sometimes with substance use. What drives it or makes it up is going to be different, right? So we've been talking about like culture, race, migration, white supremacy, like those feel very relevant to us. And for white folks, they of course also experience challenges. They're going to be made up of different things. I'm anxious in a social situation because I'm also worried about not being liked or being rejected. Sometimes they'll say, I really am worried about saying the wrong thing. Or I want to show this person of color that like I like them, I value them, but I don't want to overdo it. That's part of my anxiety. Or sometimes white guys will say, I find myself attracted to only white guys, or I find myself more attracted to guys of color. And both of those bring up anxiety because both of them make me feel shitty. So the anxiety is widespread, but it's made up of different things based on people's experience and social location, the information they have, their analysis of the world, etc. So this book is also useful for white gay men, not to worry.
Do we have time to talk a bit more about health, physical health?
Health is a big one. When we think about the connection between health and mental health, people might say, or they might wonder, where does your physical health fit into a book about mental health? But actually, if you're in pain, if you experience disability, if you experience stigma as a result of living with HIV, all of those are physical health things that have psychological and social manifestations, right? There's also, for queer people and trans people, our experience of health care. In the UK, you would have access to free healthcare, which is the same in Canada. People think that is what accessibility is, but just because you can access free healthcare doesn't mean it's adequate, right? Do you feel comfortable to come out to your healthcare team? Do you get proper information about HIV, sexual health? Do you get pathologized? Are you seen as riskier than other people? Do wherever you get tested or seek healthcare, do they understand some of the norms of your subculture? Like you go to a doctor and they freak out that you did MDMA on the weekend. You're like, okay, this is not even a big deal. Relax. Or you're like, oh yeah, I had condomless sex, but I'm on PrEP. And then they go into a big lecture about that doesn't protect you against other STIs. And you're thinking, no, I'm aware and I don't care. Eh, You need somebody who gets that. I think adequate healthcare, access to good healthcare that feels culturally competent is not so widely available. I think for our trans kin who rely heavily on healthcare to get assessments and hormone therapy and gender affirming surgery, um, as a result of stigma and pathologization, they might avoid accessing healthcare. And then that has detrimental effect on their mental health,
Yeah.
right? So I think physical health is intimately connected to mental health. And there's a lot of experiences of systemic barriers to accessing good healthcare. And then when you do access it, if you are living with something that affects your daily life, then we're talking about how you're perceived in the gay community as somebody living with a health condition, whether it's chronic or acute. And then we're also talking about stigma that shows up in the dating world, sex, like if you're seeking casual sex. Yeah. And just stigma around how people evaluate your worthiness. I did HIV testing for a few years in Toronto. And even though at the time we knew HIV was a chronic illness, we've got medication, you can live a long life. When people first tested positive, I won't say for everybody, but for a number of people that tested positive, and when I was doing the testing, one of the first things they said was like, how will I date now? Who will want to date me? So it didn't matter what the science was. That was the first thing that came up for people. And so that's heavy. It takes time to work through. And that says a lot about what that person thought about HIV before they tested positive, and also the communities they were in that socialized them to think that way, regardless of what the science said. I think health is really an important thing. Another thing, if I may, is we can't talk about health without talking about aging. We lost so many people to the epidemic that we are now seeing maybe the first generation of people who are gay and aging, and hopefully aging well. However, they're confronting ageism, exclusion from the community, and not a lot of support. So if somebody experiences cancer, if somebody experiences more episodic disabilities or chronic health issues later in life, there's a huge isolation that comes with that.
Yeah.
And navigating healthcare all over again, depending on what you're talking about, you don't necessarily need somebody to know you're gay, but sometimes you do, right? You want to be able to ask your physician, will this medication for diabetes, or will this treatment for, I don't know, cancer treatment, how will this affect my sexual function? How will it affect my physical appearance? Those are things that are important in our
Yeah.
community. We can critique them, but we can't minimize the fact that they're important to people.
Yeah. It's a good thing to feel good about yourself. I think. It's
Yes,
definitely something that is critical for me. And physical appearance is part of it. It's not all, it's only physical appearance, but it's part of it.
it is part of it. Yes. I think for a lot of queer people, gay men in particular, I think one of the ways we cope with, it's a weird way to say this, but to cope with not being straight. So, for example, if we're not partnering up and having long-term relationships, if we're single longer or for our lives, for the entirety of our lives, if we are not having children, if we're doing things in our own way, part of the way we feel better about this, okay, at least I'm aging well, or I look better as I age. It's one of the things we rely on, I think,
Yeah.
because we're like, my life doesn't look like that guy over there who's straight, but I have this to rely on. It does play a role, I think, in how we see ourselves.
I completely agree. Where can we find you online, and where can we find the book?
So if you go to ladyativan.com, LADYATIVAN, that'll take you to all my links, and you can find my books, all my social handles, ways to get in touch with me, ways to book me as a speaker. Everything is in one spot. So ladyadavan.com. And it's called The Mental Health Guide for Cis and Trans Queer Guys. And I will be in Europe and the UK in a lot of July. And I may even stop in Brighton.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really good to that content coming from somebody who's not white.
I appreciate that so much. And so thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening and watching. Feel free to share if you think that anyone needs it. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye.